Hey, learner, great to have you with us again. We know you're here because you're all about leveling up your understanding of the world, getting right to the heart of things, and, well, no one really wants to get bogged down in the nitty-gritty details,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. We hear you.
So today, we're diving deep into a question with some serious weight.
Hmm.
What's the roadmap for middle-income countries looking to break through to high-income status? And we're basing our exploration on a pretty substantial source, the World Development Report 2024.
That's right. This report, it really takes a comprehensive look at economic development, kind of unpacking the shifts that need to happen for countries to move forward. I mean, it's like a deep dive into the different paths available to these economies, the ones that have moved beyond those low income levels but are hungry for more.
Yeah.
And our goal today is we want to extract those really crucial insights, those kind of surprising bits of information that'll give you a solid grasp of what's going on, the dynamics in play, and the actual potential these countries have.
Sounds good. So right off the bat, the report kind of throws down the gauntlet talking about this middle income trap.
Oh, yeah.
Can you break that down for us? Well, why is this such a big deal?
Absolutely. You see, the middle income trap, it basically describes this risk, or a real risk that countries face, right? They hit a certain level of economic growth, they move past that low income status, but then they stall. They can't seem to reach that coveted high income level. But here's the thing, the report, it makes it clear this isn't some kind of inevitable fate, but it's a real danger if countries don't get proactive and change their approach. And what's really eye-opening, the report actually indicates that the chances of middle-income countries pulling off this transition, they've actually gotten slimmer in the last decade.
Slimmer. What's behind that shift?
Well, there are a few powerful forces all coming together at the same time. A lot of these countries, they're dealing with heavier debt burdens, and that really limits their ability to invest in future growth. You've got aging populations putting pressure on their social safety nets and possibly shrinking the workforce. On the global scene, we're seeing more protectionist sentiments in advanced economies, and that makes it tougher for middle-income countries to access those crucial export markets. And then, of course, there's this huge global push for an energy transition, right? I mean, that requires enormous investment and some fundamental reshaping of their economic structures. The report, it really drives home just how difficult this is by highlighting that only a tiny handful of economies have actually made it to high-income status in the past 30 years. And that's something you can really see in the data in Figure 1.1.
Wow, yeah, that is pretty sobering. So even before all these recent global headwinds, was this middle income trap something people were worried about?
Oh, definitely. The report actually points out that this has been a recognized challenge, I mean, since at least 2007. You see, the idea is that those growth engines that get a country from low to middle income, the ones that work in the beginning, and a lot of it is about accumulating capital and focusing on basic manufacturing. Well, those same engines, they don't necessarily have the horsepower to get a country all the way to high income status. That next phase, it usually requires much higher levels of productivity, real innovation, and sophisticated service industries.
Right, so it's not just about pouring more investment into the same old strategies, and I think that's where the report introduces this two-eye strategy as a way forward. What's the core idea behind that?
That's a really key part of the report's analysis. They argue that middle-income countries, they need to shift gears, evolve from what they call a one-eye strategy, which is all about investment, heavily focused on investment, to this two-eye strategy. And this new approach, it puts a lot of emphasis on both investment and what they call infusion.
Infusion, what does that actually look like when you put it into action?
Okay, so think of infusion as actively going out and finding, adopting, and then really broadly applying foreign technologies and those proven business practices within the country. It's not just about attracting foreign capital, it's more about a conscious effort to learn from and adapt the best global know-how, tailor it to the local situation. And the report really underlines how important it is to be open to economic ideas from other countries.
Makes sense.
They also highlight this critical supporting role of a strong secondary education system and those really solid vocational training programs. It's about ensuring that the workforce has the skills to absorb and actually use these new technologies effectively.
So it's not just about having the fancy new tools, it's about having a workforce that knows how to actually use them and build on them. Are there any countries that have successfully navigated this infusion stage?
Oh, yeah. There are some great examples in the report. Take Chile, for instance. They took salmon farming technologies from Norway and successfully adapted them. And they had key support from institutions like ProChile and Foundation Chile. It's a great story. They actually became a major player in the global salmon export market. Then you've got the Republic of Korea. Their industrial policy back in the 1970s and 80s, it really encouraged companies to adopt Japanese technologies, even offering tax breaks for those royalty payments. Figure 0.6 really shows how strategic that shift was. And then there's Poland. Their experience after joining the EU, it really demonstrates those benefits of what we call technology spillovers, that transfer of knowledge from those more advanced European economies.
So it's infuse first, that's the foundation.
Yeah.
What's the next step after that? Is that where the 3I strategy comes in?
You got it. After successful infusion, the report lays out this follow-up 3I strategy. So once a country has actually absorbed those global technologies, once they've built that strong base of technical expertise, they can then start shifting their focus towards innovation, moving beyond just borrowing and adapting and starting to push those technological boundaries themselves, developing their own new products and processes.
Sounds like a natural progression. But the report also throws up a caution flag about putting the cart before the horse when it comes to innovation, right?
Exactly. The report, it really warns against jumping the gun and prioritizing innovation before you've got that solid foundation of successful infusion.
Right.
They point to Latin America in some ways as a cautionary tale. In some cases, efforts to push innovation might have started a bit prematurely, maybe before they had fully developed that capacity to effectively adopt and adapt existing technologies from around the world. And that can actually make a country less attractive to investment.
Makes sense. So we've talked about strategies for moving up that income ladder. But the report, it also really digs into the internal dynamics of these economies. You know, this framework of creation, preservation, and destruction. So what are these forces, and how do they shape the whole transition process?
This is where we get into the real engine room of economic development, I guess you could say. The report makes the case that these successful transitions, they really depend on striking this delicate but crucial balance between those three forces.
Okay, let's start with creation. I mean, that sounds pretty self-explanatory, right?
You'd think so, but the report, it actually brings a more nuanced perspective. The traditional economic view, the one often associated with Schumpeter, it put a lot of emphasis on those disruptive new businesses as the primary drivers of innovation, while those established companies, well, they tended to resist change. But newer evidence, especially when you look at middle-income countries, it suggests that both new and established firms, those incumbents, they actually contribute to creating value.
Right.
In fact, in these economies, the larger firms, they often employ most of the highly skilled workforce.
So the big established companies, they're not always the roadblocks to progress.
No, not necessarily. They've got significant resources, they've got established access to markets, and they've accumulated a lot of knowledge. But here's where things get interesting. It's that force of preservation where those incumbents can potentially become a bottleneck.
Right.
The report argues that those large corporations, state-owned enterprises, those powerful elites, and even certain social groups that have benefited from the existing system, and the report specifically mentions how men, historically, have often benefited, they can really resist change. They might try to influence policies to benefit themselves. They might prioritize maintaining their own status instead of promoting that merit-based competition. And they can basically work to keep things as they are, preserving those arrangements that work in their favor.
So how does this preservation actually play out in a middle-income economy? Are there any concrete examples?
Oh, it shows up in all sorts of ways. Societal norms, those deep-seated biases, they can really limit opportunities for women and marginalized groups, and that prevents them from fully contributing their talents and fresh perspectives. You've got social networks, particularly those family connections, that often dominate the job market.
Right.
And the report points out that in lower and middle-income countries, something like 40 to 80% of workers find their jobs through those connections. So that can shut out more qualified people who aren't part of those circles. Even something as basic as where people live, their neighborhoods, can create huge differences in access to quality education and job opportunities.
Right.
And that contributes to that limited social mobility. Figure 5.5, it really illustrates those relatively low levels of internal migration in a lot of these middle-income countries. And that lack of movement, it makes it harder to efficiently allocate talent across the whole nation. And then there's this ongoing underutilization of women's skills and potential, right? I mean, it's because of discrimination in things like business ownership, hiring, and pay. And that's highlighted in figures 5.7, 5.9, 5.0, and 5.11, it's a significant part of that whole preservation dynamic.
It sounds like those preservation forces can really put the brakes on progress, keeping those fresh ideas and more dynamic players from emerging. And that leads us to, well, destruction. I mean, that just sounds negative on the surface.
It does, doesn't it? But here's the thing. It's absolutely crucial for momentum, for moving forward. When we talk about destruction in this context, we're talking about that essential process of dismantling those outdated or inefficient arrangements. Businesses that are failing, technologies that are obsolete, policies that just don't work. It's about freeing up those valuable resources, that capital, that labor, and allowing them to be put to more productive, more innovative uses. The problem is that weak institutions and resistance from those powerful incumbent groups, well, they often stifle what we call this creative destruction in middle-income countries. But there's a glimmer of hope in the report. They suggest that crises, whether it's an economic downturn, a political shift, or some kind of environmental pressure, they can sometimes create these windows of opportunity for reform. You know, those moments when that entrenched resistance weakens a bit.
So how can countries actually work to create that balance between creation, preservation, and destruction? Another report talks about disciplining incumbency. What does that involve in a practical sense?
Disciplining incumbency, it's all about creating a fairer, more competitive environment, preventing those established players from unfairly holding back economic progress. The report, it really stresses the need for those strong competition regulations, the kind that encourage new businesses to enter the market without punishing large, successful corporations unfairly. And one key challenge they highlight is the role of those dominant state-owned enterprises, especially in crucial sectors like, well, fossil fuel-based power generation. They can actually block the adoption of cleaner, more innovative alternatives, things like renewable energy.
So it's about promoting competition, but with a very specific purpose.
Exactly. The goal is to cultivate what they call contestable markets. That's where those established firms, they're constantly facing pressure to innovate and get better because they know they can be challenged. Someone might come along with a more efficient or technologically advanced product, whether it's a domestic startup or an international competitor. And the report outlines several policy tools that countries can use to achieve this weakening, those preservation forces we talked about, actively encouraging the creation of new businesses and innovations, and directly tackling those harmful existing arrangements. You can actually see a good summary of these in Figure 7.2.
Okay, what are some of those specific policy levers that can be pulled?
One big step is to start rolling back those protections that have been given to those incumbents, including those state-owned enterprises. We're talking about getting rid of exclusive licenses that restrict how many companies can operate in a particular sector and eliminating regulations that give an unfair advantage to those already established firms.
Right.
The report also highlights this negative impact of those overly strict product market regulations, those PMRs, in a lot of middle-income countries. That's something you can see detailed in Figures 7.4 and 7.5. And then, a big government presence in the economy, as illustrated in Figure 7.7, that can also discourage those new businesses from entering and distort healthy competition.
Okay.
Even things that might seem unrelated, like addressing those patriarchal gender norms, they can play a role too. I mean, it's about challenging that male dominance in the workplace and fostering a more meritocratic approach to how we allocate talent.
The report also brings up foreign direct investment and those multinational corporations in this context. How do they fit into the idea of disciplining incumbency?
FDI and MNCs, they're presented as really important channels for the transfer of technology and best practices. You can see that in Figures 7.9 and 7.9. They bring in new production methods, provide access to international markets, and help countries become part of those global supply chains.
Okay.
And there are great examples of this. You've got Poland, after joining the EU, seeing those positive spillover effects from those R&D intensive sectors, and Costa Rica, where those domestic firms supplying those MNCs experienced big improvements in their productivity and employment.
Right.
Then there's the whole issue of tackling anti-competitive behavior, things like cartels. It's discussed in Box 7.5 and Figures B7.5.1 and B7.5.2.
Yeah.
The idea is that when you crack down on that kind of stuff, it actually pushes those incumbents to innovate instead of colluding. But here's the catch. You need well-funded and effective competition authorities to make that happen, and that's highlighted in Figure 7.11.
All right, so we've talked about leveling that playing field by disciplining those incumbents. But what about actively encouraging and rewarding the right kinds of activities?
Right.
I know the next part of the report focuses on rewarding merit.
This is where we see a really important shift in focus. The report argues that instead of just aiming for a specific income distribution, government policies, they should really prioritize enhancing both economic and social mobility. The idea is to reward what they call merit activities. These are actions by individuals and firms that create those positive ripple effects for society as a whole, actions that lead to a more efficient way of using resources. And they pinpoint three key areas where this focus on rewarding merit is super important: the economic and social mobility of people, the value created by firms, and reducing those greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so let's unpack that. First up, enhancing the mobility of people. What are the key elements there?
The report, it really stresses how important those strong foundational skills are. We're talking basic literacy and numeracy. Those are absolutely essential as stepping stones for social mobility. Figure 8.1 and Box 8.1, they examine what happened in Finland and Chile, and they show how countries that made it to high income status, they really prioritize developing those foundational skills. The report also digs into various initiatives designed to better align education with what the job market actually needs.
Right.
Things like dual vocational training programs, apprenticeships, and those integrated curricula. They cite examples from Ecuador, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia, and they also highlight using incentives and performance contracts to make sure those skills being developed are relevant to what employers are looking for. We see that in Finland and Denmark, and it seems to be a valuable approach.
But there's a potential downside to those merit-based systems if those fundamental skills aren't available to everyone, right?
Yeah, that's a big caveat. The report warns that if a large part of the population doesn't have access to a solid basic education, then focusing solely on those merit-based schemes, well, it can actually make those existing inequalities worse.
Right.
They advocate for a more holistic way of defining and rewarding merit in education, maybe looking beyond just traditional metrics like exam scores.
Okay.
They also talk about the importance of those high-quality universities and sustained public investment in strategic research areas, particularly in STEM fields, health, and the whole energy transition. And fostering strong partnerships between universities and industries, that's seen as crucial too.
Right.
Facilitating that exchange of knowledge and driving innovation through things like tax incentives, technology transfer offices, those science parks, and they give examples like Brazil's Unicamp and South Africa's Chamalagam project.
So what about rewarding merit in the business world? How does that work?
The report really emphasizes that to have a dynamic business environment, you need a certain level of what they call up or out pressure.
Up or out?
Yeah, it means those more productive and innovative firms, they need to be able to grow, and in that process, they kind of displace those less productive ones. They advise against just blanket support for all small firms because that can actually prevent unproductive businesses from exiting and lead to a situation where resources aren't being used effectively.
Interesting.
They use this example of Spain strategically liberalizing its auto industry, it's detailed in Box 8.2, to illustrate how carefully opening up to competition can drive that necessary creative destruction. The report also touches on the influence of corporate governance practices and how family control can impact the growth of firms. And then, of course, connecting those entrepreneurs with the resources they need, things like financing, experienced mentors, and access to markets that's considered critical for nurturing innovation and growth, especially in those emerging markets.
Right.
You can see that illustrated in Figure 8.5 and through the discussion of those business accelerators.
Okay. And the third key area for rewarding merit is linked to those greenhouse gas emissions.
Exactly. The report, it pushes for respecting what they call the merit order in energy markets.
Okay.
Essentially, it means prioritizing the most cost-effective energy sources, and increasingly, those are those renewable energy sources. Figure 8.7, it shows how the prices of renewable energy have come down significantly in many middle-income countries, and a lot of that is thanks to well-designed competitive auctions. When that merit order is allowed to function properly, it naturally encourages the adoption of those low-carbon energy sources because they become, well, they just make more economic sense.
Makes sense. So the report wraps up by discussing capitalizing on crises with a specific focus on those climate and energy crises. How can those are significant challenges. How can they be turned into opportunities for those middle-income countries?
The report, it actually reframes those crises as potential catalysts for positive change. Their argument is that these crises, they can weaken those deeply entrenched forces of preservation and create these openings for significant reforms that might be politically impossible otherwise. And the climate and energy crises in particular, well, they're driving those rapid advancements, those cost reductions in those low carbon technologies globally. And that presents a really unique opportunity for middle income countries, not just to adopt those readily available technologies, that infusion we talked about earlier, but to potentially become major producers of those green intermediates and components for those global supply chains. And that could really help to lower the overall cost of global decarbonization
So
efforts.
it's a win-win. But are there any conditions that need to be met for this to happen?
Oh, yeah, definitely. To unlock that potential, you need both an improved and stable investment climate within those middle income countries themselves, but also a crucial reduction in those protectionist trade policies from those G20 and OECD countries. That's highlighted in Figure 9.5. Attracting efficient domestic and foreign investment in those renewable energy projects is vital. And the report, it stresses how important it is to carefully analyze that broader social rate of return on those investments. It's also important to remember that while those high-income countries have mostly reduced their emissions by improving energy efficiency, well, economic growth is still the main driver of those increasing emissions in a lot of those middle-income countries, as shown in Figure 9.11. And the report issues this clear warning. If those current policies in those countries continue unchanged, there's a real risk of busting those global carbon budgets.
So that journey for those middle-income countries to reach that high-income status, it's a complex one.
It is.
It requires this strategic combination of embracing that global knowledge, fostering that robust competition, and making those forward-looking choices in the face of those pressing global challenges like climate change.
Exactly. It's about successfully navigating those two key transitions, right? That shift from just focusing on investment to also prioritizing infusion and then moving towards greater innovation.
Mhm.
And all of that while actively managing those inherent forces of creation, preservation, and destruction within their own economies. I mean, it's all connected. Disciplining those entrenched interests, strategically rewarding those activities that benefit society as a whole, and seizing those opportunities that emerge from global crises. It's a complex puzzle.
Yeah, it really is. But this report, it provides a really valuable framework for understanding these critical issues. And it really drives home the point that achieving that high income status, it's not some automatic outcome. It requires a proactive, adaptable approach.
Yeah.
So for you, the learner, thinking about those deep connections in the global economy and that urgent need for climate action, what role can individuals and those collaborative international efforts play in supporting these transitions in those middle-income countries? I mean, it's a question worth pondering. We really encourage you to dive into that full World Development Report 2024 for a much deeper, more complete understanding of all these dynamics. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.